Good evening to all of you. Good evening, Gaurav. Good evening, the benefactor. What is your real name? You just wait for 2 more minutes and then we are going to start. Good evening, Shreya. So, am I audible and visible properly? Can you just quickly let me know in the chat if I'm audible and visible properly? Atmesh. Om. Hi, good evening. How was weekend for all of you and how was Monday for all of you? Sharbani. Okay. Good evening, Sharbani. Okay. Hi, Vidhi. Good evening. How has Monday been treating all of you? I had a very slow and unproductive day at work, so I'm hoping to change that by having a fruitful session with you guys. Good evening, Samriddhi. Secret Santa vibes all over. Yeah, Christmas is just around the corner. Good evening, Prajwal, Aditya. All right, I hope all of you are geared for today's RC session. Okay, let's just focus and do some active reading. Okay, so let me just pick up from where I had stopped after my first RC class. I don't know how many of you attended the very first RC class that I took, but there were some tips and tricks that I had given at the end of those classes. Those of you who attended must have remembered that. Okay, so I just want to keep reinforcing these common mistakes that students make, and I want to make sure that by the time you guys are going to give XAT, at least any of these mistakes you do not get stuck in. Okay, so what we are going to try and do today is we're going to add a little bit on top of that. Okay, all of this stays. You do active reading, you don't skim through the passage, you don't try and memorize facts, don't worry too much about very heavy vocabulary. Okay, try to make sense of what the author is saying with or without the vocabulary. Okay, understand the scope and purpose. All of those things that I have written here, they stand. What we are going to do is now try and build on top of that. Okay, so a very important thing to understand in order to increase the accuracy of cracking your RC questions in eliminating the options that are not making sense or not correct is trying to understand in what all ways can distortions be given to you. Okay, so how are these options created? Okay, how are these wrong options created? They will take something that is already given in the passage in some way, some concept, and they are going to do something to it. Okay, they are going to do some add on something to it which is going to make it wrong. Okay, so these are called distortions. In some small ways there will be a word added or something, the option will be hinting that is probably not there in the passage. Okay, so you have to try and understand in what all ways wrong options are created to throw you off track. Okay, how are these distortions created? What kinds of these distortions usually are present in RC passages? If you will understand, you will actively be on a lookout. Okay, that this is all I should be paying attention. So let's talk about some of these distortions that you might have encountered before. I don't know if you have actively understood the pattern or tried to analyze that. And what we will do is through the RCs that we are going to do in today's passages, we are going to try and practice that. Okay, how to filter out through the distortions. So one of an important way in which a wrong option may be designed to throw you off guard is by converting something which is suggestive, a probable correlation or a probable causation. They will turn that into an absolute or an extreme. Okay, so what I mean by saying that is, let's say if the passage is hinting that X may be leading to Y, or X may be causing Y, okay, or Y, X may be the reason why Y is happening, okay. So this is what the author is talking about, and he's hinting, or let's say he's trying to propose you or persuade you that, X is the reason that may lead to something happening later on, which is Y. Now here, there is some kind of a correlation that the author is trying to propose, right? But in the option, if you come across any option, that suggests X always leads to Y, okay, so now that is an absolute. That means there cannot be any exception ever. X always will lead to Y. If there is X, there will always be Y. Learn to understand the difference between a probable causation and an absolute causation. Okay, the certainty, the level of certainty is hyped up. Okay, now that is very, very, very important when you're making managerial decisions, right? To understand the probability of what one event happening may lead to the other event. Okay, so if there is a slight probability, and if you're saying there is with 100% certainty X is going to lead to Y, your decision will change. Okay, so these kinds of distortions where a certain probability is changed into an absolute certainty is meant to, test that do you have what it takes to understand where there was just a suggestion that X may lead to Y and there was not 100% certainty, right? So you need to eliminate that. So what I'm trying to say is, whenever you see an option where there is some kind of suggestion of absolutes and extremes, just like I said, in decision making, you have to be very careful. Now I'm not saying that never in a passage you will come across an absolute. It is possible that the topic or the nature of the passage is such that, it could be written that X always leads to Y. All I'm saying is, usually the way passages are written and usually the way arguments are made, authors tend to refrain from making very absolute statements. Even in the most persuasive arguments, most persuasive of the passages, you will see that they are hinting towards some kind of causation. Okay, they will not say that it always happens. So if you see the word always, ultimately, any kind of an absolute kind of a correlation that it is suggesting, be very, very, very careful and double check and triple check that is this a distortion, or was the passage actually saying that X always leads to Y. Okay, so that is the first distortion that you should always keep an eye out for. Okay, never let a probability, a certain level of, and if there is a certain level of uncertainty given in the passage, don't choose an option where the level of certainty has been hyped up by making it an absolute. Okay, the second distortion that you will find very, very, very often in options that are wrong is that they take certain keywords from the passage, okay, but they put it out of context. What happens is, when you're reading passage, because you're reading it very fast and you're trying to understand what the author is saying, certain keywords get registered in our brain. Okay, certain keywords or key points that the author keeps coming back to again and again, they get registered in our mind that the passage is talking about these ABC keywords. Now they will take those same ABC keywords, because they would be very familiar to you and you would be understanding that the author is talking about them again and again. They will put them in the option, but they will add a small tiny little detail, which will change the context in which those keywords are used. Okay, a very, very, very subtle change, but a change which is big enough to completely change the meaning behind it. So don't always randomly just go by keywords. As soon as you see familiar keywords in an option that have been used in the paragraph, don't just think, oh ha, author was talking about this, so this must be the correct option. Check if those keywords, what they are saying has been put in the correct context. Okay, so in other words, try and understand the context behind those keywords, not just the keywords. Okay, so that is another very common, way in which the paper setter is going to try and throw you off guard. Okay, take something very 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 familiar so that you feel it's right, and उसमें एक छोटा सा change कर देंगे जिससे उसका पूरा purpose और पूरा meaning ही बदल जाएगा. Okay, the third kind of distortion that I want you to be very 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 careful about is whenever there are certain kinds of contrasts that have been drawn, you know, X versus Y, or some kind of a relationship between any two objects, any two concepts. If the author is talking about any contrast or any kind of relationships between two subjects, it could be objects, it could be concepts, it could be anything, okay? It could be two theories, whatever it is. So whenever there is some kind of a relationship, positive or negative, that has been talked about, understand the core idea behind that comparison or relationship, okay? Because the author's argument may be very tightly weaved around that relationship. What you would see many times in wrong options, which seem like they may, you know, they were right, is they will take one part of that argument and they will give you something that was written in the passage, but they will ignore the relationship part. So X versus Y, as compared to X, Y is not great. Okay, let's say author is saying something like that. The option might just be talking about how Y is not that great. Okay, now essentially when you read that, you feel like, okay, author ne bola hai ye, Y is not that great. But you cannot forget to see that, yes, the author has said Y is not that great, but that was said in relation to X. So in the option, the relationship will be very, very, very conveniently forgotten, or, you know, deleted out of it, and only one half of the argument would be presented. Okay, so technically what is written is not wrong, but it is not giving you the entire picture because it is ignoring the relationship that the author had kind of sketched out through his or her argument. Okay, so be very 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 careful whenever there are contrasts and relationships between any two subjects, any two concepts, any two objects that the author is talking. Okay, so in the options, if you see just one thing, just see if there is a better option that talks about that relationship rather than something in isolation. Okay, so that is another way in which distortions are created in the options. And the last one that I wanted to talk about was the way in which distortions are created is whenever you find a question related to what was the main idea behind this particular concept that the author was talking about. Okay, any concept, XYZ, ABC. So the author has, let's say, talked about something. Okay, and the question is asking, what did he really mean by this? Okay, now the passage I told you in previous classes also will always have a certain flow of arguments. The author has written a long passage and he has built up his argument with a certain flow where he first introduces the topic, introduces the problems, he may give some arguments, some counter arguments, some examples, some supporting arguments, and conclusion. Okay, within the options, okay, there will always be an option which is the right option, of course, which actually talks about the core of what that topic is, what X is. So let's say the author has talked about X is this. Okay, let's say we are talking about spirituality and the author talks about, okay, spirituality means this or spirituality is this, and then it will soon be followed by, let's say, another sentence or idea about how spirituality can lead to something much greater. Okay, so there is, both the sentences would be talking about the same thing, spirituality, but you have to understand the subtle difference and the nuances between one is part of the definition of what spirituality is, and logically from that definition the author is saying is it leads to something else. Okay, so when the author says spirituality may lead to something else, you will see that part in the option to kind of throw you off guard. Okay, because when you read that option, it feels so right, and the author has talked about it. You are just not able to understand that that was not the main definition of spirituality, but something that just flowed logically after that argument or a consequence of it. Okay, so try and learn to separate behind the main ideas of, you know, what is the core idea that is being presented to you. Okay, definition here, a definition is leading to a consequence. Okay, so there is a subject, there is a definition of the subject, and then there are arguments to support it, there is a consequence, or understand the flow of the arguments, okay, because something similar will be put in the options to throw you off guard, and you will feel that अरे ये तो सही था. Okay, so these are some of the distortions I want you to actively look out for and try and practice while we do today's RC. Okay, so with that, without further delay, let me quickly show you our RC1 for today. Here is the first question. Here is the second question. And here is the third question. Done? Again, this is the first question. One last time. Second question. Third question. Okay, done? Let's discuss the passage, what it was about. How many of you understood what the passage was about, and how many of you found the passage difficult? Quickly let me know while we start discussing it. Okay, all right. So the passage talks about something called elevation. Okay, so we don't know what it is right now, but the author is going to explain it well to us. Okay, so what the author says is, earlier elevation was something which was only discussed through philosophy and religion. Okay, but now it is being scientifically studied even by psychology. Now, traditionally, the author says psychology was only focused on negative emotions and disorders and what went wrong. But now, recently, psychology has started focusing on something called positive. All right. So, the author says that now psychology is also trying to understand what makes people feel good. Now he talks about a certain psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, okay, and I really really love this psychologist. He's an actual psychologist, by the way. He's written a lot of books about evolutionary psychology. I've myself read a couple of them. So, what does Jonathan Haidt explain? Jonathan Haidt says that elevation can kind of act like a mental reset. Okay, a mental reset in which it will replace all kinds of cynicism, negativity with positive emotions like hope, love, optimism, and moral inspiration. So, what the author is trying to say right now in this first paragraph is that elevation can sometimes be transformative. It has the potential to replace negative emotions in your head with a lot of positive emotions, negativity with something more, a lot of positivity, okay, positive and moral feelings. That, so in paragraph number 1, the author is introducing us to the concept of elevation, okay, and telling us that it is something that psychology has tried to now start studying. Now in paragraph 2, okay, so what does Haidt quote? Haidt quotes great oratory. Okay, here the author is trying to connect elevation to very motivational and powerful language. Oratory is like speech, right? The way in which you talk. So Longinus believed that elevated speech does not just it's not just persuade, it is not just logical, but it transforms the audience emotionally. Okay, so truly elevated speech doesn't is not something which convinces people just in terms of logic, but it has the power to transport them emotionally to a higher state of being, to a higher state of mind. A good speech, a good oratory speech is not about argument, but it is about inspiration. Okay, so the author's intent here is to show that elevation through language has a profound emotional effect which goes way beyond any kind of a rational persuasion. Okay, such feeling was once part of our public discourse. What does this mean? Is the video still buffering for all of you? Let me check. Is the video still buffering for all of you? Is it not okay? All okay now? Okay, all right, all right. Okay, let's continue. So, where were we? We were at the sentence, such feeling was once a part of our public discourse. Okay, discourse. So historically, speeches were aimed to inspire and elevate the audiences emotionally, not just persuade them through logical arguments. Okay, so this was very common. The author is saying that earlier when people used to give a speech, that was very common, that you made a speech in a way that you riled people up emotionally, okay, not just tried to persuade them logically. That was very common of public discourse. After hearing Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, some slave Frederick Douglass said that it was a sacred effort. Okay, so what does Douglass say about Abraham Lincoln's speech? Douglass says that the speech was holy, noble. It was something that was morally uplifting, almost like a spiritual experience. It was not just a speech. It wasn't just rational arguments that were being thrown at the audience, it was more like a spiritual experience. So it wasn't just political, it was a speech that touched the soul. Okay, so the author's intent here is to tell you historically how speeches were designed to elevate you to a certain level of emotional being. But uplifting rhetoric came to sound anachronistic, except as practiced by the occasional master like Martin Luther King Jr. Is it still buffering? Oh God. Okay, 1 second. All right. Is it fine now? I just rebooted the software. Is it fine? I hope it's fine now. Perfect. Okay, great. All right, let's continue. Okay, so after hearing Abraham Lincoln, what did Frederick Douglass say? That his speech was not just a political speech, it was a speech that touched the soul. It was more like a spiritual experience. But such uplifting rhetoric came to sound anachronistic. Okay, anachronistic means old fashioned, something that dies out. It's out, it's not trendy anymore. Okay, so the author is saying that, you know, it's now this, at once upon a time it was very common for people to give such speeches that emotionally riled up people and, you know, helped them transcend to a different kind of an emotional state. But this has fallen out of time. It's become old fashioned. It's no longer fitting in the current era. Okay, speeches aiming to elevate people emotionally have become very rare and they seem outdated, except some rare occasions when such deliveries happen, such like exceptional leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so such rhetorics, such speeches are declining in modern times. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph. It was a while looking through the letters of Thomas Jefferson that Hyde first found a description of elevation. So what is elevation? Okay, so Hyde discovered that Jefferson had written about this feeling that we now called elevation. Okay, so it is something that existed a long time ago also, and Thomas Jefferson has written about it. Jefferson wrote of the physical sensation that comes from witnessing goodness in others. It is to dilate the breast and elevate the sentiments and privately covenant to copy the fair example. Okay, so what does this actually mean? Dilate the breast and elevate the sentiments. So what it's trying to say is that when you feel elevation, there is a certain kind of a physical sensation that you feel in your chest, that feeling of dilation, that your chest has expanded, okay, with positive strong emotions, that gooiness that you feel physically inside that chest. It's a physical openness or swelling, okay, that often accompanies very strong positive emotions. And elevate the sentiments means it takes you to a higher moral or a higher noble level. So physically you feel that and morally you feel that, okay, and it is not something that you just feel at a physical level. Once you feel that elevation, okay, you want to copy the example, copy the fair example of all the people who, the person in front of you who has been able to inspire that level of elevation in you. Okay, so when we experience elevation, we don't just admire goodness. Inwardly, we want to emulate it. We want to do the same thing. The person in front of us has probably exhibited some great goodness, some very noble moral act. When we look at that, we feel something physically in our chest, a kind of a positive emotion, swelling. At the same time, we want to emulate that at a moral level. Okay. So elevation can often gives us chills or a tingling feeling in the chest. So elevation is not just something which is emotional. It has a physical manifestation. When we witness acts of goodness or moral beauty, we will feel something like chills or a warm sensation in the chest. Okay. Now this physical reaction is the key indicator that elevation has occurred, that you are actually going through this emotional state of elevation. So elevation is not abstract. That is what the author is trying to say. You can actually observe it through physical bodily sensations, like, you know, feeling those chills and feeling those the swelling, the feeling of swelling that happens inside your chest. Okay. So the bodily response is the best evidence that elevation actually happens to people. Okay. So elevation doesn't just feel good, it biologically also promotes social bonding. Okay. So here later on in sentence 4, the author talks about how the hormone oxytocin gets released when you are experiencing is the screen still illegible? Because I can see it perfectly fine here in my screen. All good. Yeah, okay, all right. So elevation is not something just you feel physically, you also find it biologically. Now biologically, oxytocin is released when we are going through the state of elevation. Okay. So oxytocin, which is known as the connection hormone, it is involved when the vagus nerves gets stimulated, and this hormone, because of this hormone, elevation can be tied to neurobiologically and can be scientifically measured. Though indirectly, it is possible to measure elevation. Okay. In the next paragraph, the author tries to talk about how elevation is not just an emotion in isolation. In fact, it belongs to a group of emotions, and each of these emotions make you go beyond yourself. Okay, beyond your self-interest and ego. It connects you to something much, much, much larger. Every 2 minutes there is a 10-second buffer. Let me check. Maybe I can decrease the output quality. Let me just give me a minute. I will just check.